Hi. I mean, he said that this production kind of has a history of where it's come from, but it was, let me just make sure my fly is closed. There we go. I just came from a costume fitting, so you never know.
But that wasn't your costume.
This production was really important for me in the beginning. It's one of the very first things that I did as I was starting out, being sort of switching over from being an assistant to doing my own shows just a few years ago. And actually, it's like 7 years ago now, but we're not really counting. And I was just sort of giving an interview this morning talking about sort of where the idea of the production came from. And I was working in Berlin at the time. And I had lots of time because you're an assistant, you know, you're not like really worried about the show that you're doing. You're worried about the show that you're going to be doing one day. And then you find out you're doing Hamlet. And it always sort of seems to me like you're surprisingly, unsurprisingly, that the space that you're in when you're creating the production is sort of influences what the whole thing is going to be. And one thing in the sort of the east side of the Brandenburg Gate, when you go down towards the Deutsche Oper on that side, that there's these sort of big monumental buildings, and then there's like very obvious holes where things used to be that are no longer there. But it's almost like they couldn't get rid of, during, things got bombed and destroyed and whatnot, and they would sort of clear away the rubble, but yet there's these sort of foundations of society that stay. You still have the sort of the plinth of the building, and there's the stairs that lead up to it, and you can sort of make out where the columns used to be. And I was thinking it's not so unlike when you go to the Foro Romano, and you see the same thing. You can see this was the palace of, this was the temple of Diana, or this was that. And they're not usually standing still, or if they are, they were sort of put back up in the 19th century. But you sort of see these sort of empty places. But what the spectator brings to the situation is kind of reinventing, and almost these sort of, even though it's all made out of like stone and concrete and things, that you sort of make these sort of ephemeral looking, sort of dreamlike structures in your brain, like what would have been, and you sort of imagine how tall would that have been, and what would the top of it look like, and did it have a dome, or all these things. So I found that to be kind of a magical space. And then there was, in the middle of one of these buildings, it was all sort of like concrete, and it was a bit sort of overgrown with like grass and dirt and gravel and whatnot. Then there was a plaque in the middle that was just kind of overgrown, saying that in the spring of 1940, blah blah blah, I don't remember the details, that's not important. But it was like, this is where they burned all of the books that were in the library that used to stand next to this space. And it was this sort of, and it sort of continued this idea of what was in the space, and this sort of idea that this like fire and knowledge and everything being burned, it sort of felt like some ancient temple. And it's interesting, even in German, like the word for monument is kind of like, think about it. So these ideas, so when you're feeling like very German at the time, it all just sort of makes perfect sense. So I hope that it translates years later. But anyway, in Kansas City, actually, budgets and opera and everything being what it was, I feel like this opera is a bit like Stone Soup, because they asked me to do the show, and they were like, but can you do this with like minus money, like? And I'm like, well, yeah, let's see what you can do, because I was so eager to do anything. And it felt actually kind of, it had this sort of after the war energy to it, because they were like, we have a whole warehouse filled with stuff. What could you do by rubbing two sticks together to make a production? And that was actually really exciting for me at the time. And then it ended up being successful and unsuccessful in lots of different ways. I mean, you don't know until you rehearse it, if you're taking risks, I think, how it's all going to work out. And then luckily a few years later, Washington National Opera was wanting to do it, and Placido was conducting it, and he looked at it and he said, this is really interesting, we need this kind of thing. But, he said, the one thing is, it just kind of feels like it's missing something, like on the back wall. And I was like, oh, you mean this? And I pull out of my laptop, and I'm like, you mean this big, beautiful back wall that I designed that never got built because there was no money? He was like, yeah, let's do that. So then it gets built. So, by degrees, and then we've come here, and Minnesota Opera has also invested resources into making it something new as well, and it gives me a perfect opportunity, already with the cast, as you saw yesterday, even with the music, of saying like, this cut list, and how does it work, and I don't know, and we have to mark the parts, and all that. It's like, no, we're going to figure out what we're going to do with the actual real people in the room, and it makes such a difference to say you sing this line, tacit there, change that to an E flat, and then we kind of all figure it out, and then it feels like we're doing a world premiere. of, right, so we have lots of talented people, but then next, so you, sort of this world that I was talking about, sort of Denmark. One thing about Shakespeare, whether it's like turned into an opera or whether it's just, good old-fashioned Shakespeare, is that he's very inspecific about time and location and things. It's not like, here is the key with which I will open the 18th century door. And, it's not that sort of specificity. So for a director and performers, I think it's really exciting that you can sort of fill the ideas. You're talking about, love and incest and remorse and regret and all of those things, of course, are pretty timeless. Blood and guts. So this sort of like frozen tundra idea and sort of old institutions sort of being sort of vaguely held together was kind of an inspiration for me in the beginning. Obviously this is in Russia, but this kind of just sort of bleak sort of like not knowing where you're going, and is like, do we still believe in what that church represents and that's why we're holding it together, or is it falling apart because we stopped believing in it? These are the sort of questions you should think of. And then I kind of like the idea of these like sort of watchtower idea. It's even the same kind of vocabulary, and it's a bit sort of scary looking, like bang bang, border. There we go. Then, so again, combining all these ideas. So imagine this. I was thinking, well, Denmark, it wasn't a communist country after the war. It gets divided up. It ends up on this side. But what if, already we're in an imagined history, if after the Second World War, if Denmark had sort of fallen under the icy Western imagination of what the other side of the Iron Curtain would have looked like. So you sort of have these sort of Soviet ideas, and that's obviously Red Square. And so it's taking all of these images that you'll see throughout the staging and with the set design come all the way through. I was actually in Moscow like 2 months ago for some auditions for something else, and I was so excited. I was finally going to go to Lenin's tomb and going, but it was shut down, the whole square for the day, for 2 days actually, like exactly the 18 hours that I wasn't in the theater listening to auditions. It was open. But I couldn't go in, but instead what was there was this massive military parade that was an annual celebration that they do, 50th anniversary, something, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it was in Russian. I didn't exactly catch everything. But they had the Russian troops going all the way back to like medieval times, all the way up to like their version of like the Navy SEALs, and there were like battalions. It was like some sort of halftime show, but sort of like Russian scaled, with like thousands of these troops, and they were like the snowy, like the ones in Rabbits with like Uggs with pom-poms, and like big guns, painted white. I mean, it was kind of cool in a sort of like 42nd Street sort of way. But then you were like, they could kill you. But the interesting thing about it was that, like, going through, you sort of saw the sort of the monumentality of the military might, and that it's not all about sort of function, but it also has this kind of theatrical quality to it as well. And also we're sort of slightly in we're like at the dawn of the new media world and how everything goes. So anyway, these are sort of the images that influence. And next, I'll sort of click through these. But you can sort of see like, this is like almost exactly the thing I was talking about in the beginning. That's where the wall is. But you can see these buildings that used to be and a statue that used to be. And, like obviously that didn't used to look at a wall and all, and sort of like, project housing and stuff across the street. But you start to sort of fill in what used to be with the, also the church. I love this idea that like religion is out and graffiti is in. Next. And even just sort of this, like look at that old woman there, she's like pointing at a body, and she's like, oh, you wouldn't believe, like last night I was watching my program, and then like there was bombs, and then there's a body, and, immediately you start recreating the story, and then the sort of like mass, waiting the tides of people that are not benefiting, from the new system. Sort of regime change. I mean, this opera itself, the whole story, I mean, the Hamlet itself is a regime change opera. It begins a little bit later than the play. There's like sort of a missing act. It's the Fontainebleau scene that is gone by the wayside. But it opens with the father of the King Hamlet. The father of Hamlet is dead, and the new king is coming in. One thing that's always sort of bothers me with the piece is everybody's like, oh, the old King Hamlet, he was so fantastic, and now this like mean Claudius has come in, like, but maybe the old Hamlet was like really bad, and maybe Gertrude and Claudius were like helping things move along. Like, usually when we kill dictators, like it's like, yes, like good, like we threw his body in the ocean, and then we'll like make an Oscar award-winning movie about like our bravery and all of that. But so why is it that Hamlet is like, we have to believe that his father was like this good guy? Maybe he was this horrible guy and people are feeling liberated. And so there's lots of possibilities. But maybe Hamlet can also be, I sort of try to add like every possible idea of conflict for him, that he's like, I know my father was a horrible leader, but he was my father and he loved me and we would like play baseball as a kid. And so I don't want him dead, but even though politically I know and I feel sort of trapped between all these things, these are all things we can explore as we go along. And also talking about the period, because it's sort of the made-up history that never happened. Imagine it's like, boom, the wall, not the wall, but sort of the treaties in the end of the 40s, all the way up to 1989 or 92, we could say. We can live sort of anywhere in that world, and you think about how fashion, magazines and images were really controlled, and you would sort of maybe get things like decades apart. And, even sitting on, the subway in East Berlin still today, or you go even further to Leipzig or Chemnitz or something, like you sort of see these people that haven't quite like caught up with what we might think MTV looks like, or, you can Prague, Bucharest, Moscow. It's like shifting geography also shifts time. In a weird, it even happens in this. I go home to Tulsa for Christmas. Dear. Next. Yeah, we got burning books. We got all of that. Next, you get the idea. But see, then, like, we can dance, and this is what's happening inside the palace. It's all sort of Wiener Opernball, that never stops. Like, we will live. In Italian, they say, si stava meglio quando si stava peggio. Things were better when things were worse. So it's like, we'll still live this sort of, it's like people in the South that kind of live in this Gone with the Wind sort of world as well. So even though we've seen these bread lines outside and whatnot, inside the palace, and you'll see with the Queen and the King how they're sort of still living in a certain place. Yeah, it's cold, it's snowy. Yeah? Yeah, so we get sort of, who are the characters, then how do we sort of mash together these sort of ideas of elegance in, Marcello Mastroianni and Marlon Brando, but sort of mixing together so these iconic, classic, sort of troubled, angst-ridden young men. It's kind of our Hamlet idea. Very sort of simple, iconic, and there's like Ophelia being like, I love you not. Am I going to have to kill myself? Well, probably, but can we not talk? And he kisses her hand. Gertrude's just kind of above it all, and she like gets the magazines flown in from Paris. She gets dresses flown in, and then she's like, no, I don't like that. We're going to change the color. I look great in orange, for example. But she just literally just fills her days with looking beautiful and singing. Right, so you get this idea, sort of putting these like classic diva ideas, Tebaldi and Eva Peron. You sort of mix a little dictator, a little poodle together, and that's kind of the world of elegance. And she changes costumes like every 5 minutes. Every time she comes on, she's kind of in a new invented look. It's like when I was a kid, I used to look at the Butterick patterns, and you'd flip through and you'd be like, I want to be all of those things. So finally, here you are. Then we've got sort of. I put some good guys in there too. It's like Willy Brandt, Nikita Khrushchev, Marshal Tito. It's sort of mixed together ideas of dictators. This is sort of Claudius. But again, like with Willy Brandt up there, it's kind of like, yes, we will have a new democracy. Everything will be moving forward. But then yet you've got these people that like starve their people like Kim Jong-il style. So, you're not quite sure where we land. And next. Right, and then this scene inspired the whole Aryan duet, where it's like the new leader's in and he sits for his portrait to be taken, in this sort of Kennedy era, Kennedy Center looking bust. You wouldn't know that all the people in those buildings on the other side are starving, because this is actually in Dubrovnik. I think, it's a lovely place near Croatia there, but horrible things are happening just outside the frame. And this is sort of the rest of the family, and we get to the coronation. So again, we're sort of mixing up this like 60s, early 70s kind of Lady Bird Johnson, meets royalty. And then next here, yeah, sort of the same thing. We've got the sisters and the aunts. Yeah. Yeah, more men waving, more bodies being dragged around. You get the idea. Big military presence, caskets. Right, there we go. Prostitutes at the end, street people. Oh, yep. Funeral, Ophelia dies, sort of classic, iconic American images, mixed together with the cold and the snow. Right, so then how does it, these are all good ideas, but how do we do it? The very first thing you see when the curtain goes out, the very first thing you see in the foyer in the theater before we begin, you actually see dead King Hamlet laid out like he's lying in state. Yeah, we're going to have to move like the T-shirt selling booth, I think, but we'll talk about that. So like you go to the Capitol building, you go to whatever to visit the body of the dead person laying in state. So we'll have the chorus that's involved in that, like they're there like mourning, and it's like, oh, we're so sad because if like our leader dies, then of course we have to be sad about it because it's all. And then when the new leader comes, we're happy about it. So we see these emotions that are sort of controlled by the state and the media. And then during the overture to the piece, the actual prelude, then through the auditorium aisle, we see the casket. So now he's not in the glass casket that he was laid out in. It's like the wooden casket is in like carried through with a flag draped over it. So it's all that sort of Jackie O sort of thing, love you, bye. And we go, oh, it's sad, and we're gonna project these images. There's like live cameras, so it sort of feels like it's a bit like Beyonce. Except the lights are going to stay on for Act 2. And so we have this whole sense of like we have a real connection because it's the part that the opera left out that we don't really understand like what happened to the death of the king before. So at least we get that in the overture. And then boom, the introduction to big number 1 begins, and then we see like the proletariat, the people of the streets saying, they come out with like, pipes and 2x4s, and they're like knocking this thing down like Iraq in 2005, like pulling down this huge statue, which we believe is like the old dictator. And then they get rid of that, and then immediately it goes to the next scene, which is like all of a sudden out of nowhere, there's like all these soldiers come, and they're like setting up the impromptu press conference, at the mausoleum in Red Square to hail the new king. So it's like lights, it's snowing, it's cold, there's police, there's broken stuff, there's microphones. And so like on the camera version, it's like all zoomed in, and it kind of looks great. But what you don't see when you're like the home viewing public is like the graffiti and everything is sort of broken down. Right, so then it's basically like a unit set, and these are like a mixture of like my original set renderings and live pictures. But so it's kind of like this weird sort of Colosseum type space. It's hard to see in these pictures, but there's this upper level, and then there's this big plinth where a building used to be, and then there's like some book burning happening in the background, and then the ghost comes out from that neighborhood over there. It's all sort of like metal and concrete. Next. These are kind of blown out, but you get a little bit more sense, and you can see like, somebody's like ripped out all the electrical wires on the back wall there, like stealing it to recycle the copper. And there's like skulls that are kind of in the, because the York scene is gone, which I think is kind of sad, where he's like the comic relief scene. So there's these skulls that are incorporated into the graffiti. I had these 2 really cool graffiti artists that came in like real kids that like we found on the internet. It was like, we'll give you $500 worth of spray paint and like 3 hours, and then I think you had to pay extra for security. And then, but really interestingly, like, is you think they're like really rogue, but they followed my renderings like perfectly. But then it just looked like, but if you had scenic artists do it, it would have taken like 3 weeks and then still looked like a fake version of it. So it has this real kind of authenticity. And then in DC, when I added more, I won't tell you how I found the other 2. Next. Right. So then, again, sort of like adding in these layers. It's 1 unit set because it sort of goes. We do acts 1 and 2 together with no interval, with some cuts, so it's not sort of too long. But there's this painted drop that then appears behind the scene, so it actually looks like, this was some sort of like opulent theater. And so then we have playing around with this is the imagination of what the space was, and it's been bombed out, or is that really what it is, or whatnot? I'm not interested in answers, just the questions. And so then, so like outside, you've got like homeless people over here that are just sort of like huddling in for some warmth, but then you've got the king and the queen inside the palace that are dancing like it's 1901. Then you got the waiters upstairs. So this is the kind of idea there, the pantomime and the party scene. You sort of get a sense of like the energy, and Hamlet's unhappy there. Then big intermission, drinks come back, and then we're in the mausoleum of. So this is kind of like that idea of Lenin's tomb in the basement. It's all this sort of like glowing green kind of feeling. And there's all these busts around the floor that are looking at the dead king who's in the glass coffin to be laid there forever. But then the bust that we had seen being made in the previous act is now, and then it gets revealed in the blah, 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 the end of Act 2. It's there sort of as like the sentinel for the tomb saying, I'm the new king here. And so then Hamlet has this fantastic scene when he says, look at these 2 portraits of... when he and the mother like knock it down. He wears her out really hard for like 20 minutes. And he says, listen, he's like, look at these two portraits. Like, this is who your father, this is who my father is, your first husband. You know, he's like a lovely human being. He was great. He was my dad. He like, you know, we did all these things together. We'd go fishing. And then he's like, and look here, this is the image of like treachery and disgust. And, you know, he's defiling the marriage bed and the sheets are unseamed and blah, 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 blah. And, you know, you're an adulterous beast and all this sort of Shakespearean things that he says. And then it gets so like sort of heated up, and he's like has this huge marble bust, and he's like wielding it above her head like he's gonna smash her on the head. But then he gets really angry and he just smashes it on the floor, and then she knows. And then Polonius is a really important role in the play, and he kind of got abridged out. He doesn't have a lot to sing in the opera, but the role is still really important. And one important pivotal device that got excised from the opera that I've tried to put back in, or have put back in, is that Polonius needs to be in the so-called the chamber scene, the bedroom scene in the third act, to overhear. He's hiding behind the tapestry, and he overhears the plan, and at a certain point he like jumps out and he's like, whoa, Hamlet, I think that things are getting out of control. And then Hamlet kills him like through the tapestry and all that. So I have him listening here, still in this scene. He still gets killed, because otherwise, see, Laertes gets sent away in the first act, and then he doesn't. The reason that he comes back in the play to like come back to Elsinore is because his father got killed, and he's got to like deal with the funeral arrangements and everything. So if the father doesn't die, then there's not this reason like why did he come back, and then why do things go so badly with him? So that's all that. But this is a very dramatic scene, and it really the opera, even from its faults is the wrong word, but sort of the parts that it's missing, it still maintains the sort of the classic exposition structure building up to confrontation in this sort of third act, you know, the top of the thing, and then we've got denouement, falling action, all of that. So it does sort of hit the classic Shakespearean structure, which I'm pleased about. That's the opera and opera production. So then just sort of zooming in and close-ups and, you know, this idea of like father and son, there's all sorts of opportunities for interesting symmetries there. There we go. Right, then, hard to see in here, but when we finally get to the fourth act, Ophelia's scene where she's finally left the palace, everything has sort of been dirty and gritty and whatnot, but we actually, for the very first time, it's like there's this huge white sort of sheet that's pulled out over everything, and it's like she's seeing the world pure and clean there. I'm going to change this a little bit here. And then so at the end, she's like going mad, blah, 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 da-da-da-da, cadenza up, da-da-da-da. And then she's like, Hamlet, I can't deal with my life without you, so I will die. And then she turns and she jumps like Tosca style, shunk, off the back. And then magically, seconds later, then she appears. This looks amazing in the theater. The picture never gets it because it's all kind of like sparkly. But it looks as if she's jumped in her dress into the water, and this is like ice that's broken away. And then she's like floating underwater, and she's like, I'm with the willies now. Art. So that's how that ends. But it's kind of like blinding, and you can't quite see what it is. And it's like, oh, what's she doing? That's really magical. And cut. And then we go to the next thing. Right, and then the very last thing is the funeral of Ophelia, where the whole thing ends up finishing up. So if you look at the bigger scene. But what I didn't say, actually go back for just 1 second. The gravediggers perform a really important role, because everybody in this opera is talking about big ideas and incest and rape and love and, you know, all these huge emotional ideas. The gravediggers are like, we're just doing our job, you know, from 9 to 5. We're going to dig a grave. And the woman says, who are we digging the grave for? He's like, I didn't really look at the list this morning. He's like, just shut up and keep digging. And like, what's for dinner? And then like their girlfriends turn up and bring them like a chicken box. And they nibble a little bit. It's cold, you know. They drink, they smoke, they throw the bones in the hole. And it's just kind of like, you know, it's a chicken, it's a dead girl, it doesn't really matter. So it has this, again, the classic sort of Shakespearean idea, the Yorick scene comes just at that moment when you can't take any more sort of tragedy and seriousness. You have this like bit of lightness in the whole thing and sort of dust to dust, it doesn't really matter. So that scene is still very much a part of what's going on. So then Laertes comes back and everybody gets killed in the end, I think. So then finally at the end of the funeral, blah, 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 I won't give it away all now, but this idea of like the sort of the theater and the palace and everything, it comes back for this one kind of like fleeting image, like the last 5 seconds that Hamlet is kind of aware, and that, you know, like you see that big spotlight and everything, it's almost like, you know, good night, and we'll see you at the next one, in the next life. So it ends with this sort of big theatrical flourish with a lot of dead people. Then, is that it? Yeah. We'll see you there.
Thaddeus, could you talk about the ending a little bit?
Yeah.
The original
Sure. Well, I mean, the original ending in the play, everybody's dead, and it's very complicated. It takes, like, a whole act. There's, like, poison, swords, and conspiracies, and wine. Like, Claudius is bound and determined to get Hamlet killed, and so he's like, we'll stage a duel. Like, and then that'll be good, because then, like, in the duel, like, he's not so good, and Laertes will, like, get him good. And then he's like, then we'll, like, poison some wine, and if he gets thirsty in the duel, we'll also give him a drink. So that's, like, double duty. And then Laertes is like, I know, I have this, like, cool stuff that I keep in my bag, that if I dip my end of my dagger in it, and then if I so much as, like, touch him, I don't even have to, like, stick him good, then he'll be dead. So there's, like, 3 ways to kill the guy. It takes a long time. And but in the opera, when it was first premiered in France, they just made a happy ending for it. There was a lot of conventions, a lot of rules. I mean, theaters today don't have union rules that restrict what we can do. But back then, they had a lot of rules. And so it was not really necessarily desired. I mean, we look at Verdi as well, that he changed a lot of his things. So we can't take that as a definitive version as to why it was. It's all of a sudden, it's like, everybody's dead except for Hamlet, and he's like, hello, everybody, and they're like, we proclaim you to be the new king, and we sing in unison, and blum, 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 chunk, it's over. But that's not really, like, satisfying to somebody that understands, like, the larger context of the Shakespearean saga. So then when the opera premiered at Royal Opera House Covent Garden, then it needed to have a new ending written for it. But they did, like, this really short ending. Instead of, like, answering all the interesting dramaturgical questions, they were like, well, if we just, like, back it up, like, 4 pages and then cut it off here and be like, he's dead, that'll also be good. Which is also kind of unsatisfying. So every time I've done this before, we've done it sort of in different ways, and there's lots of musical material that's there that can sort of be cut, shortened, text that comes in and out. So yesterday, already in the musical rehearsal, having the real people that are really going to do it, we tried like 5 or 6 different ways already of, like, is this bar open? Is that bar closed? Do we, like, cut this, cut that? And it's like, we'll have to see. I think we came up with, after that, we came up with a version that we think is going to work, but the next thing is to put it on its feet. If we could just imagine how all this would be, then we would all just, like, stay at home and, like, put a USB cable in our temple and then, like, do it. But since we can't, we have to rehearse and come together and, like, sort of figure out what the strengths and weaknesses of everything are. And I think that ultimately I'm not interested in any sort of, like, academic rigor in what we're doing. It's, we have Hamlet to put on as an idea, like, you get the poster, Hamlet, like, that's what Dale's asked me to do. And, we'll figure out, hopefully by the first or second performance, what, our Hamlet is. Like, if you think about, you've just been through a really interesting process here with the world premiere, and you do a lot of them. I think that the excitement of it is thinking of it as something that is a goal and a direction towards getting right. And, obviously we're talking about, like, 20 seconds of the night, not like 4 hours of the night. So it's a bit more of a contained problem. But we're creating the Minnesota version that, hopefully goes down in the history books, that at some point they're like, well, the way they solved it was. And I don't know, we do our round of performances here, and then hopefully everybody who's in the cast, then goes on and they do these productions elsewhere with other teams and sort of keeps it going. And then they say, well, you know what? When I was actually up there performing it in front of 3,000 people, 5 times in a row, like, something in the back of my head was always saying, what if, or, and then that gets added to the dialogue. So hopefully, we're part of a much longer process. I do not see this as the end days for our art form, but just the very beginning.
Does anybody have any questions for Thaddeus? This production is, I think, just so dynamic. It's wonderful to see, and I can't wait to see it in the Ord way. And it's wonderful for our 50th anniversary as well, to do this sort of interesting and dynamic production here at Minnesota Opera. Does anybody have any questions? Thank you very much, Thaddeus.
I'm here all week. Thank you.